Hello everyone, and welcome to our weekly call. I'm Rupert Watson, Head of Asset Allocation in our wealth business. We're committed to ensuring the content of these webinars is as useful as possible to you, but we're also aware that you may have some specific questions. So please submit any questions on the webinar and we will answer them in a Q&A document which we'll send to you after the event. And please feed back any comments and suggestions you might have. And of course, please reach out to any of us at Mercer if we can be of help. I'm going to start by giving a brief update on the UK economy and the economic restart. James will then discuss funding level volatility and how you can manage it. Rebecca will discuss what a rapidly changing landscape could mean for pensions and benefits in the higher education sector. Neil will discuss the challenges facing employees and employers as we approach the return to work phase. And David will finally share the latest findings from our May Talent and Reward Survey. So turning to my first slide, we had earlier this week the UK GDP numbers out for the first quarter. And so that, of course, covers January and February, where things were reasonably normal, the start of March, where things were normal-ish but beginning to deteriorate, and a lockdown at the end of March. And according to the numbers, UK GDP fell by 2% quarter on quarter. The chart you can see here goes back to 1990. And so you can see that there was an almighty fall in 2008-9 during the great financial crisis. And the fall in the first quarter of this year is reasonably close to the fall we saw at the worst point during the financial crisis. But it's going to get worse. And so the low point is likely to be in the quarter we're in at the moment, which will encompass a complete shutdown in April, and a large shutdown in May, but perhaps a few things beginning to open, and hopefully possibly a slightly better July. But we're expecting Q2 economic growth to be 2 or 3 times worse, or maybe even 4 times worse than that seen in the first quarter. And so a truly historic collapse and huge recession in the UK. Now, please don't switch off, but I thought I would just comment very briefly on GDP terminology. And please, as I say, don't get a cup of tea, because there's an awful lot of GDP numbers that are flying around. And you will see the Bank of England said the UK economy will fall by 30% or thereabouts in the second quarter. So I just want to reconcile all these different numbers and what they mean. So normally when you talk about a GDP number on a quarterly basis, you can express it in 2 ways. You can express it what actually happened. So what actually happened in Q1 was the UK GDP fell by 2%. But many economists and governments talk about the quarterly numbers in annual terms. So they take that 2% number, annualize it, effectively timesing by 4, so they get to an 8% fall. And so when the Bank of England and others say the UK economy is going to fall by 30–40% in the second quarter, what they really mean is it's going to fall about 10% in actual terms, which annualized is 40% at an annualized rate. And so when you I thought it's just worth noting that when you see all these GDP numbers flying around, it's important to try to distinguish between whether it's quarter-on-quarter actual or quarter-on-quarter annualized. And I hope I haven't bored you going through that. Turning to the next page, I thought I'd have a brief comment on what the return to work might look like, economically speaking, essentially the economic restart. And it's worth noting to begin with there's a difference between what we're allowed to do, which one might think of as the supply side of the economy, versus what we want to do. So at the moment, we're not allowed to do a whole load of stuff. But even if we were allowed to do a whole load of stuff, there is a question mark whether we would want to do it. And we might not want to do things either, perhaps, because, of course, some people have lost their jobs, but others may not want to go and hang around at a concert or a sporting event or a pub or an aeroplane or public places more generally. And so there'll be two things we'll be looking out for. The first is what the government lets us do or encourages us to do, which in a way will be sort of easy to measure. We can just read the newspapers, listen to the government, and then the second bit being what we will actually do. Different countries, different regions, different states are doing things at different speeds. Even within the UK, what's happening in Scotland is not the same as what's happening in England. And different countries, different regions are taking things at different times. So here are a few states in the US, what they're doing. Some of the states have opened tattoo parlors. Who knew that that was an essential item? And different states responding at different periods of time. I did also interesting on the bottom left. I thought I'd show this chart, which is a survey of people in different countries, saying the question is we should start the economy and allow business to reopen even if the virus is not fully contained. And people in different countries have different views on that, and some of that is around income. And that if you were in a poorer part of the world, in many cases you're more worried about the economic impact than you are about the virus impact, with both likely to have significant impact on your overall well-being. We've seen a slight bottom right opening of US airports, but still we're talking about footfall in US airports being still about 10% or less than 10% of what is normal. And so some things at a high level we think are likely to restart reasonably quickly, but a full return to normal will take quite some period of time, and much will depend on whether the number of cases is brought down to a very low number, or whether just a moderate one, and we're still terrified of doing things. And at that point, I'm going to hand over, but thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Lewis, and I head up the investment strategy team in the UK for our fiduciary clients who have delegated some element of portfolio construction and the implementation of their investment strategies to Mercer. Today, I'd like to talk to you a little about managing funding level volatility, something that I'm sure you'd agree is pretty topical right now, given the impact the market turmoil has had on funding positions, particularly over 2020. Now, before we can understand how to manage volatility at a detail level, I think it is always best to take a step back. Consider the wider question, which is simply, do you have a clear plan on what you are trying to achieve through your investment strategy? You really can't manage the volatility until you understand the ultimate destination and the risks that you intend to, or in fact need to take along the way as part of that journey. Once that thinking is done, though, you can look to maximize your chances of success of delivering the required return whilst managing volatility in a few simple steps. Step one sounds easy if you say it quickly: build better portfolios. And this is about the assets that you hold. Here, a better portfolio is one which will help you manage the security of the funding level that you already have, whilst not giving away the opportunity to deliver growth from here to close any funding deficit. In reality, of course, it is a complex balancing act where you really need to understand the different ingredients and how they blend together. If I can use an example from the Great British Bake Off, you basically need to be a star baker to blend that portfolio to maximize the chances that you can protect and grow your funding position. And on previous webinars, we've discussed some of the current investment opportunities in portfolios. Step two then links back to that overarching plan and thinking about what to do to that portfolio balance between growth and protection as your funding level improves. A single strategy is unlikely to work throughout the journey, so you need to be ready to act to ensure that you run only as much return and risk as you need, reflecting the progress that you have made. By carefully planning in advance and identifying funding level improvement milestones, you can remove the emotional element from deciding what to do when improvements in funding are achieved. and this can have a very, very material impact on reducing your funding level volatility. So why is that? Well, as you achieve these preset funding level milestones in the good times, you're reducing risk in the portfolio, meaning that you're becoming increasingly defensively or protectively positioned as you hone in on full funding. That in turn is protecting you in the event of any negative shock that could come your way in the future, compared to a simple strategy which doesn't evolve as the health of your funding position improves. Then finally, step 3 comes towards the end, and it's about security and removing, to the extent it is possible, that funding level volatility completely. When you reach a fully funded position, don't let it go. Think about how hard it was to get there and how painful it would be to have to start again. And the focus here is around protection rather than running risk in the portfolio in pursuit of future growth. If growth still is your aim at that stage, you probably just haven't identified your true destination yet. Now, this is all very good in theory, but there is an implementation barrier to overcome as well. For most trustees, they typically meet once a quarter and think about making decisions using market information which is often out of date come the time of the meeting. Unfortunately, often that is too reactive an approach, and we are seeing more success with clients who look to implement their plan in a much more live manner, tracking the funding position daily to make sure they capture what can be short-lived market opportunities, boost funding levels, and reduce future funding level volatility. The chart on this slide is a simple case study of one of our clients, showing the funding level progression they made over time. They carried out steps 1, 2, and 3 after they clearly mapped out their plan and destination, which in this case was a buyout. They invested in an efficient portfolio, which ran a degree of risk initially to close the funding gap, but along the way they hit 9 funding level milestones as their funding level improved from 80 to 100% before moving to a full protection strategy, looking to replicate how an insurer would invest before finally transacting with an insurer. So in summary, the best way to manage your funding level volatility is first to take that step back. Have a clear plan on what you're trying to achieve so you can understand the risks and decide if they're acceptable. Then optimize your portfolios. Next, make sure you identify in advance how you want the strategy to change over time. And finally, make sure you can implement the plan efficiently so you don't lose the benefit of your thoughtful planning and foresight through leaky implementation. I'll hand over to Rebecca now. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I'm Rebecca Dodd, and I head up Mercer's Higher Education Group. The higher education sector is unique. With around 500,000 employees, universities are so important in the UK, and COVID-19 is having a massive impact. And it's going to have a big impact on pensions and benefits for employees in the sector as well. There is a mixture of public and private sector pension schemes at universities. There's the local government pension scheme, teachers' pension schemes, which are public sector schemes. Then there's a number of universities with local private schemes. And then, of course, there's the University's Superannuation Scheme, or USS, which is a sector-wide scheme for academics and researchers across many universities in the UK, and is actually the UK's largest private sector pension scheme. But what's different for universities is that most of their pensions are still defined benefit in nature. In the UK, there's around 11 million people in private sector pension schemes building up benefits. Less than 10% of these people are in defined benefit pension schemes. More than 90% of people now in the private sector in defined contribution schemes. In the university sector, it's completely the reverse, with way less than 10% of members actually in defined contribution schemes. Now, the higher education sector itself is unique, but the long-term issues faced from these defined benefit schemes are just the same as any others. Worsening funding positions, volatile markets have caused increased and uncertain costs. And that's not just confined to the private sector schemes, it's absolutely the same is true for the public sector schemes. In fact, last year, the teachers' pension scheme in England saw employer contributions rise from around 16% to nearly 24% overnight. Before COVID-19, universities had already started thinking about their pension benefits for their staff. And whilst the higher education sector isn't private in the sense of profit-making, universities do have to generate their own income to cover their costs and stand on their own 2 feet. Staffing accounts for well over half of all the costs in university, and therefore any changes in pension scheme contributions can have a massive effect on the cost base. Income comes from tuition fees in the main, so having faced the pressures of drastically reduced government funding over the years and the threat of cuts in tuition fees, together with rises in pension scheme costs, the universities have been looking for ways to control those pension scheme costs. In particular, USF itself is proving to be one of the major issues faced by universities. USF has generous hybrid benefits, a combination of defined benefit and defined contribution, but USF has seen worsening funding positions at recent valuations, rising employer and employee contributions, disputes about the method of calculating the liabilities in the first place, and union strike action to try and keep its staff with those defined benefits and lower contributions, which has affected so many students across universities in the UK. And now COVID-19 has brought with it a new wave of issues for universities, issues that are very likely to change the future of the sector forever. Universities have had to adapt very quickly in the short term. We've seen lectures taking place virtually and exams are being undertaken online, but we've seen halls of residence empty, conferences and events cancelled, and some staff and support roles furloughed. Cash reserves and continuing income from tuition fees for this year may be able to cover costs in the short term, but what about next year? Absolutely, universities will be able to adapt to this new digital virtual world of learning while it has to, but will universities still be able to attract the students that they need to keep going? International students may not be able to come to the UK at all to start university next year and may not return for their second or third years. And will the same number of UK students still want to go to university? University is about the life experience as well as academic learning, and the university experience could look very different after next year. Student numbers plus a move to a more digital world will affect universities' incomes, and it will affect the job market in the sector, and things could look very different going forward. Seeking to maintain those defined benefit pension provisions may become lower down on the priority list for employees themselves, looking for flexibility and choice, and cost control is going to be vital for those universities. Change is coming, but change doesn't have to mean bad. We're all facing this new normal, and universities will face this new normal. Pensions and benefits will need to evolve in the sector, but perhaps that's sooner rather than later now. Right, on that, I will hand you over to Neil.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, Rebecca. My name is Neil Atkinson. I'm the Proposition and Innovation Leader at Mercer Marsh Benefit. I just wanted to share with you some insights and some things to think about when looking at challenges which face two different sets of stakeholders when going through the return to work, or the kind of how we motivate the economy to start up again. When we look at this from an employee perspective, it's important to realise that when physically returning back into the workplace, it's an incredibly individual journey for everyone. Even though you may be part of a segment of people which looks homogenous on the outside, actually the journeys that individual people go through can vary enormously. And we've done some work involving some research looking at psychological models, and one of the things we found is that actually people's conscientiousness and levels of neuroticism have got an important impact on their attitude to wellness and well-being. And wellness and well-being are incredibly topical at the moment. Everyone's going through their own individual journey. Everyone's struggling with the needs of balancing work, if they're still able to work remotely, with educating children potentially who are going to school, and having support from spouses who may have been furloughed or who may still be working indeed full time. So the important thing is that it's a very individual journey, and people who have underlying mental health conditions or underlying physical conditions, this return phase can be quite exacerbated. Indeed, if you stretch this further, the situation that we find ourselves in, where people are at home more, can exacerbate the strain on family, the strain on relationships as well. So when we're looking as employers about bringing people back physically into the workplace, there's a whole multitude of things to be aware of that people are going through when they're returning back into the workplace. One of the most impactful things can actually be the commute, which is something which people don't give a lot of thought to typically. But if you're commuting to work on public transport, then you're going to be heavily impacted by the reduced capacity of our public transport network. So that's going to impact people's ability to actually come back to work physically, even if they want to. Indeed, when you look at the family thing, when you look at the concept of a sandwich generation where people have split caring responsibilities, people may be responsible for caring not only for children but for older relatives as well. And actually the process of going back to work might mean that people don't feel as though they can fulfill those caring obligations as robustly as they have been. The other thing around anxiety is that people are anxious around their job security. So there's a graphic there that says clarity over job insecurity. So this kind of neatly segues into the employer phase as well, because people need to be communicated to very robustly by their employer. And that has an enormous bearing on how easy it's going to be for people to come back to work, clarity over their job, and also to know that people have actually got that flexibility when they come to work if they need to kind of come back to work on a partial basis, or have that flexibility built in due to other family and caring type arrangements. When we look to the employer phase, there's an awful lot of assistance out there from the government. We've got 8 specific sector-specific guidance that have come out, but the number one priority is really around safeguarding health and well-being of the employees when they return back into the workplace. Whether or not that is on a selective basis or staged over time or phased, there's an awful lot of things to think about in terms of in-work social distancing, considerations around the physical aspects around personal protective equipment and hygiene. And at the moment, it's incredibly topical when looking at testing regimes. Indeed, today you may have seen on the news that the government is working closely with Roche on their antibody test kit. We're working very closely with providers in this space. But one of the things that we found with the antibody test kit is that it's got a very accurate test for the levels of antibodies in the bloodstream, but what hasn't actually been conclusively proved yet is whether or not antibodies actually linked to a decreased likelihood over the short or longer term of actually recontracting COVID-19 in the future. So we've had some good tentative steps there on that testing side, but there's still work to be done, and we're working closely with our partners in that space. The key things on that right side, obviously around the testing regime, that's extremely important at the moment. But from an internal comms perspective, communicating to employees has never, ever been more important. And it's important to consider additional means to communicate with staff through things like mobile apps and support the health and well-being of the employees. We've seen a lot of enhanced kind of demand from clients around EAPs and occupational health services, and also in the telemedicine space. So these are all things that can kind of help people become more reassured and help that segue from home working or being on furlough and actually coming back into the workplace. So that's all I had to say today. I shall hand over to my colleague, David Rayford. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil. So my name's David. I work on career projects, and that's fundamentally focusing on career frameworks as well as rewards, broader policy, and the employee value proposition and how that's framed. We did a piece of research it came out at the end of March. We've now rerun many of those questions, and we're able to draw comparisons in terms of some of the themes that organizations are going through with respect to their reward frameworks, people issues, principally through the lens of how costs can be controlled or managed or even reduced in some instances. I think the big theme from the March research was that there was a lot of unknowns at that point. Organizations were largely considering a range of activities, and it's now clearer whether they are doing them or not doing them. So most of these are from the survey. The final topic is just something that feels topical at the moment. So the first point was around headcount freezing. Most organizations have either implemented it or were considering it, and they were doing that in March. And largely, the statistics relating to headcount freezing is unchanged. So way back then, as it feels, it was 69% of organizations, and it's now around 73%. Then we look at reducing hours and pay, and what we're seeing now is around 40% of organizations are thinking about it now. Or have implemented it. And back in March, that was 27%, but those were only organizations that were considering it. What we saw was no organizations that had reduced time and pay, and now we've got about 20% of organizations that have. So that's about half of that 40% population. When we look at bonus cuts, what we had back then was about 4% of organizations who had considered it, who had implemented it, and 31% who are considering it. And we now have 12% of organizations that have implemented bonus cuts and 24% who are considering it. There is quite a large shift on those organizations that have decided not to implement bonus cuts. So it was 19%, it's now up to 42% of organizations are not considering it. What we're seeing on salary cuts is back in March, no organizations had considered or had implemented it, and now 22% of organizations have implemented it. But again, we see a shift the other way as well. So 38% of organizations were undecided, and now 55% of organizations have said that they're not going to be implementing salary cuts. If we then look to the next one, the issue, I think it's quite obvious that organizations have decided that they're not going to increase their use of contractors. We've also got this issue around a debate around whether organizations should mandate unpaid leave for their employees, and 16% of organizations have said that they are either doing it or considering it, and that is 9% of organizations have implemented it and 7% are considering it. Back in March, no organizations have done it, so there is a bit of a shift there. Back in March, we had a simplified question around pay reviews, which is it going ahead, is it deferred, is it stopped? And back then, 62% of organizations were confident that their next pay review would be going ahead. In this research, we've looked at the question from the point of view or through the lens of how imminent that pay review is. So we see 27% of organizations have an imminent pay review. 18% of organizations have one in this half of the year, but more than half of the organizations don't have a pay review until 2021. And the message, I think, is if the pay review is imminent, the chances are it will be deferred or stopped. If it is in the second half of the year, it's equally likely to be deferred or stopped or to go ahead. If the pay review is 2021, then there is still optimism and a likelihood that that pay review will go ahead. Interestingly, around bonuses and other incentives, it doesn't feel like there is a major shift. Yes, we've seen some drop in the award of bonuses in the near term, but long-term incentives predominantly going to go ahead. And interestingly also, we don't see much change around organizations' perspective on sales plans. We've updated our survey on looking at furloughing staff, so about 48% of organizations are furloughing and are using the government's job retention scheme. And interestingly, about half of the organizations that are using that arrangement are topping back up to full pay and maintaining benefits. And we're also getting from the survey lots of other interesting insights into the way that organisations are adding to the offerings to people, or adding alternative arrangements in there to control costs better by freezing pension contributions or increasing the amount of well-being protection to people, and other arrangements that organisations are putting in, like e-learning and so on. The final bullet here isn't something that is in the survey, but it is something that's been emerging through the conversations that we're having, which is, what do we do about annual leave? Because there is pushback from employees to say, well, we can't go on holiday. I would prefer not to take annual leave now. And clearly an issue emerging for organisations, the extent to which that will become a problem later in the year, either with people taking that leave, or if this goes right up till the end of this year or even beyond, the extent to which that will result in a carryover in 2021. Now, there are existing rules that say carryover is limited because people have to take their statutory leave. But the government has announced, and it's principally in the context of key workers who we want to be at work at this time, that they will allow people to take 4 weeks in addition, or 4 weeks leave into the next 2 years. That message has been picked up by other employers, and the feedback that we're getting, by other employees, and puts employers under pressure. And the message we're getting back is that, on the whole, companies are advocating well-being as a reason for taking holiday now, but they will feel under pressure to allow people to take, and probably will allow people to carry over more leave into next year and possibly the year after. And to some extent, it depends on when we feel we come out of this pandemic. So that brings the content part of this section to a close.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for dialing in. I hope you found that interesting and helpful, and I hope you can join us same time next week. All the best. Bye.